To be taxed or not to be taxed? That is the question. The First Amendment's Establishment Clause prohibits the government from making any law respecting the establishment of religion. This clause not only forbids the government from establishing an official religion, but also prohibits the government's actions that unduly favor one religion over another. It also prohibits the government from unduly preferring religion over non-religion, or non-religion over religion. But what happens when churches who are tax-exempt influence political and governmental decisions? Churches and other places of worship in the United States are exempt from a form called Form 990, which serves as an information return regarding income and financial information of nonprofit charities. The purpose of this document is to encourage transparency on the part of nonprofit charities to allow policymakers, watchdog groups, and the general public to hold these organizations accountable and to ensure the privilege of tax exemption is not abused. However, since churches and other places of worship are exempt from this form, how is anyone supposed to know if their privilege of tax exemption is being abused or not? Contemporary politics has become the playing field for many lobbyist firms that have large sums of money contributed from churches and other places of worship, most notably in the past, the Church of Scientology. This begs the question, is tax exemption allowing for a conflict of interest to flourish? Any entity that is capable of generating funds and providing financial backing, particularly in the political arena, should be treated as a business and lose all privileges such as tax exemptions, so as not to create unfair advantage over secular charities who report income and financial structuring to the IRS. Should churches and other places of worship remain tax exempt? The following are some major points that will show the positive and negative sides to remaining tax exempt. Exemption from the document Form 990, which acts as an information return on income and financial information, acts as a barrier between full transparency and accountability to church members and contributors to the church and the church's administrators. This barrier, in a way, encourages behavior that may and has led to an abuse of tax exemption instead of acting as a deterrent to such behavior. Exemption from the document Form 990 should not be allowed for churches and other religious organizations. Montague claims that the reason being that exemption places too much trust in the honesty of religious people. And this is why exemption from the Form 990 should be disallowed for religious organizations. Over the past few years, recent studies have shown that many churches have become victims of embezzlement. In fact, in a report released in 2007 by the Center for the Study of Church Management at Villanova University found that 85% of the Catholic dioceses responding to the survey reported being victimized by embezzlement during the previous 5 years. Other studies, such as the one conducted in 2000, estimated $7 billion was embezzled by leaders of churches and religious organizations in the United States. Such unaccountability and abuse of the tax exemption system stems from poor control mechanisms that are purposely put into place by churches themselves. However, most of these scandals could be avoided in the future if documents such as Form 990 were to be reported to the IRS, a federal agency which deals with Internal Revenue Code and tax law. These documents are also available to the public domain, allowing outside parties to monitor financial activities conducted by churches and other religious organizations so that they are held accountable and there is financial transparency to reduce misappropriation of funds. Research by Montague in 2013 has shown that although requiring churches to file Form 990 would not magically prevent embezzlement or improve financial oversight, the redesigned Form 990 contains a number of questions regarding governance and accountability practices, including questions about independence of directors, conflicts of interest, and whistleblower protections, auditing, and disclosure. This is further supported by the Churches and Taxes website, which stated that a tax break for churches forces all American taxpayers to support religion, even if they oppose some or all religious doctrines. As Mark Twain argued, no church property is taxed, and so the infidel and the atheist, the man without religion, are taxed to make up the deficit and the public income thus caused. Furthermore, a tax exemption is a privilege, not a right. Governments have traditionally granted this privilege to churches because of the positive contribution they are presumed to make to the community, but there is no such provision in the U.S. Constitution. Although tax exemption is upheld by the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, there are other reasons why tax exemption is an archaic and abused privilege, and the lack of accountability that stems from exemption from Form 990 is just one of those reasons. Embezzlement and other scandals can occur, but not all churches engage in malicious activities, and therefore the majority of churches and other religious groups should not be discriminated by removing their tax exemption status due to the abuses done by others. Although embezzlement and other scandals committed by churches and other places of worship can be attributed to tax exemption and the exemption of Form 990, tax exemption from the point of view of churches and other religious organizations stands as an important barrier between government overstepping the freedom of religion. Many in the faith communities of the U.S. see tax exemption as an important way to keep the government from excessively taxing churches and, in effect, silencing those churches and religious groups that aren't financially capable of paying those taxes. An interesting case showing that tax exemption is a good thing is the Waltz First Tax Commission of the City of New York. This case was brought to the United States Supreme Court. The case was filed by a plaintiff who felt that he was forced to indirectly make contributions to religious entities by paying the differences that is created by tax-exempting religious bodies. The plaintiff felt that it was a violation of his freedom from religion. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that tax exemptions to religious entities do not violate the Establishment Clause, and that tax exemptions bring minimal amount of contact between churches and state, whereas taxation would bring the two intimately closer to each other. Another important reason, as stated by Brian Quinn of WellsvilleDaily.com, is that poor and disadvantaged people relying on assistance from their local churches would suffer if churches were to lose their tax-exempt status. According to Vincent Becker, Monsignor of the Immaculate Conception Church of Wellsville, New York, the food and clothing programs his church offers would be threatened by a tax burden. All of a sudden, we would be hit by something we haven't had to face in the past. We base all these things that we do on the fact that we do not have to pay taxes on the buildings. Crucial services would either be eliminated or relegated to cash-strapped local governments if churches were to lose their tax exemptions. According to Scott Tabbs of Conservatives.com, the only constitutionally valid way of taxing churches would be to tax all nonprofits, which would place undue financial pressure on the 960,000 public charities that aid and enrich U.S. society. If only churches were taxed, government would be treating churches differently, purely because of their religious nature. Removing tax exemptions for churches and other religious entities would negatively impact churches and religious organizations and is a main and powerful point for those who support tax exemption for such institutions. The fact that a majority of churches and other religious organizations do not engage in unethical practices or engage in political life suggests that removing tax exemptions would not be a good solution to a problem that results from poor accountability and financial structuring on the part of religious organizations. Exemption from the document Form 990 should not be allowed for churches and other religious organizations, the reason being that exemption places too much trust in the honesty of religious people. However, while there have been many recorded instances of scandals ranging from embezzlement to corruption, it would be an unfair generalization to impose taxation on religious institutions, particularly when it is not the majority who abuse this privilege. To be completely fair, a solution would be to have religious institutions file Form 990 for financial transparency while remaining tax exempt, just like secular nonprofit organizations do, to reduce the likelihood of corruption and remove any possibility of unfair favoritism given to churches and not secular nonprofit organizations.